sun hammered down, a merciless anvil on the cracked earth of the New Mexico territory. Jonah Hartley sagged against a rough-hewn fence post, coarse rope biting into his wrists. Beside him, 10-year-old Ezra whimpered, his small shoulders raw with a binding sawed. 7-year-old Lila, her face streaked with dust and silent tears, stared vacantly at the vultures circling high above the desolate plain called Widow's Step. Thirst was a fire in Jonah's throat, despair a colder weight in his gut. He'd failed them. Then, a shadow stretched long across the blinding sand. A figure emerged from the heat shimmer, a woman, heavy with child, barefoot and weathered, her expression unreadable as stone. Without a word, she drew a skinning knife and began cutting the ropes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The ropes fell away like dead snakes. Jonah stumbled forward, catching himself in the splintered wood of the fence that had been their gallows beneath the open sky. His muscles screamed in protest, stiff and bruised from the hours bound. Ezra collapsed onto the parched ground, gasping, while Lila simply stood frozen, her small hands trembling, clutching a roughly carved wooden horse, her only possession salvaged before the men came. "Easy, son," Jonah rasped, his voice a desert wind scraping over gravel. He tried to bend, to gather Ezra, but his own body betrayed him, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He saw it again, the dust cloud heralding the riders, the cold eyes of Silas Thorne's hired guns. Ledger sneered as he gave the order. "Teach him what happens to squatters who don't know their place. Boys, let the desert have its say." The woman moved with silent, unnerving efficiency. She didn't offer a hand to Jonah, didn't speak a word of comfort to the children. Instead, she knelt beside Ezra, her movements deliberate despite the swell of her pregnancy beneath a faded, patched calico dress. With surprising gentleness, she inspected the raw circles on his wrists, her own hands calloused and bearing old scars. She pulled a canteen from a worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder, unstoppered it, and offered it first to Ezra. The boy hesitated, his eyes wide with residual terror and confusion, flicking towards his father. Jonah managed a nod, a silent reassurance that fell hollow. Ezra took the canteen, drinking greedily, water spilling down his chin. The woman watched, her gaze unreadable, then took the canteen back and offered it to Lila. The little girl shrank back, pressing the wooden horse against her chest like a shield. "It's all right, Dove," Jonah whispered, forcing strength into his voice. "Drink." Slowly, Lila obeyed, her small sips loud in the vast, oppressive silence. Finally, the woman held the canteen out to Jonah. The water was warm, tasting faintly of leather and earth, but it was life itself flowing down his ravaged throat. He drank sparingly, acutely aware of their rescuer's own condition, the sweat beading on her brow beneath the relentless sun. She took the canteen back, stoppered it, and stood, her eyes, a startlingly clear gray against her sun-darkened skin, scanned the horizon north, toward the jagged teeth of the mesa known as Coyote Ridge, then west, where the distant smudge of Bitter Hollow lay, and finally south, back the way she'd come. Her expression remained impassive, but Jonah saw the tightening of her jaw, a flicker of something hard and wary in her eyes. She looked at Jonah, then at the children, a silent question hanging in the air. "Jonah Hartley," he managed, inclining his head towards Ezra and Lila. "My children." He waited, hoping for a name, an explanation, anything. None came. She simply nodded once, a curt acknowledgement. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Lila's carved horse, a fleeting expression Jonah couldn't decipher. Sorrow? Recognition? It vanished as quickly as it appeared. She turned and began walking, not towards Bitter Hollow, but south, toward the broken land where the mesa bled into rocky draws and hidden canyons. She didn't look back. Jonah exchanged a bewildered glance with Ezra. The message was clear: follow or stay. Stay meant the vultures, or Thorne's men returning to finish the job. He scooped Lila into his arms, ignoring the protest in his muscles. She buried her face in his shoulder, the wooden horse digging into his collarbone. Ezra, still shaky, pushed himself up, his young face set in a mask of determination far too old for his years. He took Jonah's arm, offering silent support. "Come on, son," Jonah murmured. "Let's see where the quiet lady leads." The trek was agony. The sun beat relentlessly on Jonah's exposed neck. The dust kicked up by their shuffling feet, coating their already parched skin and clothes. His boots felt like lead weights. Ezra stumbled often, his strength flagging. Lila remained unnervingly silent, a small, trembling weight against Jonah's chest. Ahead, the pregnant woman moved with steady, ground-eating stride that seemed impossible given her burden. She didn't slow, didn't look back, a solitary figure navigating the treacherous terrain with intimate knowledge etched into her steps. Jonah noticed the careful path she chose, avoiding loose scree, skirting patches of vicious catclaw acacia, finding the faintest traces of animal trails that wound through the rocks. It spoke of a deep familiarity, a life lived hard on this unforgiving land. Memories clawed at Jonah's exhaustion. 2 years prior, arriving in Bitter Hollow with hope as bright as the desert stars. Sarah, vibrant and full of plans for their small homestead, nestled against the eastern foothills, away from the town's rough edges. The fever that took her, swift and brutal, leaving him hollowed out with 2 bewildered children in a land suddenly hostile. The struggle to keep the small herd alive through drought, the mounting debts to the mercantile. And Silas Thorne, the sleek, well-dressed predator who owned half the valley and coveted the rest, especially the meager water source Jonah's meager spread bordered. Thorne's polite offers to buy, turning to veiled threats, then finally, this morning's brutal clarity. Ledger and his 3 riders, enforcing Thorne's claim with fists and rope. Should have sold when you had the chance. Hartley, Thorne don't take kindly to stubborn fools. Reckon the desert sun loosen your tongue or silence it. The image of Lila's terrified face as they bound her small wrists was a brand on Jonah's soul. They walked for what felt like hours, the landscape growing more rugged. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the distant mesas into liquid shapes. Jonah's vision blurred at the edges, his legs threatening to buckle. Just as he thought he couldn't take another step, the woman disappeared around a jumble of massive, weather-sculpted boulders. Rounding the corner, Jonah stopped. Nestled in shallow, sheltered draw, hidden from the open plain, stood a small cabin. It was built of rough stone and sun-bleached timber, looking as much a part of the landscape as the rocks themselves. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. A small, fence plot held struggling desert plants. Prickly pear, sparse corn stalks, beans climbing thin poles. A weathered water barrel stood beneath a crude gutter system fed from the higher rocks. It wasn't prosperity, but it spoke of fierce, stubborn survival. The woman was already at the door, pushing it open. She stood aside, gesturing them in with a tilt of her head. The interior was dim, cool after the desert glare, smelling of wood smoke, dried herbs, and earth. It was Spartan. A stone hearth, a rough table, 2 stools, a narrow bed piled with worn quilts in one corner. Shelves held jars of preserves, dried meat, and simple tools. On the mantel above the cold hearth sat a single object, a tarnished silver locket, its clasp broken, lying open. Jonah glimpsed a faint outline of a tiny portrait inside before the woman, with a swift, almost protective movement, picked it up and tucked it into a pocket of her dress. Her face remained impassive, but the gesture was a shout in the quiet room. She pointed toward a pile of folded blankets near the hearth, then moved to the water barrel visible just outside the door, returning with a dented tin basin filled with precious water. She set it down on the table, then retrieved a clean, ragged cloth from a shelf. Her eyes met Jonah's, then flicked towards Ezra's raw wrists and Lila's tear-streaked face. The silent instruction was clear. Tend to your children. Jonah lowered Lila gently onto the blankets. She clutched her horse, her eyes huge as she took in strange surroundings. Ezra sank down beside her, exhaustion finally overwhelming his brave front. Jonah dipped the cloth into the cool water, its touch of benediction. He began to clean Ezra's wounds as gently as he could, the boy flinching but staying silent. As he worked, he watched the woman. She moved to the small hearth, stirring the embers back to life with practiced ease. She filled a blackened kettle from a smaller water jug. Jonah noticed a hairline crack running down its side and hung it over the growing flames. Her movements were economical, devoid of wasted energy, yet burdened by the life within her and the palpable weight of her own unspoken history. The broken locket, the cracked jug, they were fragments of a story Jonah couldn't read. She prepared a simple broth, the aroma of wild onions and dried meat filling the small space. She placed 2 chip bowls on the table, filled them, and gestured for Jonah and the children to eat. Still not a word. Jonah helped Lila sip the broth. Ezra ate with the desperation of the starved. The woman sat on one of the stools, watching him eat, her hands resting on her rounded belly. Her gaze was distant, focused somewhere beyond the cabin walls, beyond the present moment. Jonah saw the deep weariness etched around her eyes, the lines of hardship and grief that no silence could hide. Who was she? What loss had driven her to this solitary existence? And why risk herself, burdened as she was, for strangers tied to fence? As the broth warmed his core, a fragile sense of safety began to seep into Jonah's bones, a feeling so foreign after the terror of the day. He was about to attempt words again, to offer the meager thanks that felt utterly inadequate, when the woman's head snapped up, her gray eyes, sharp and suddenly alert, fixed on the cabin door. She held up a hand, a clear command for silence. Jonah froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. Ezra stiffened. Lila pressed closer to Jonah. Then, faint but unmistakable on the still, late afternoon air, carried on the breath of the desert wind snaking through the draw, came the sound, not the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a lizard. It was a rhythmic, distant beat of hoofbeats, several of them, getting closer. The woman's hand slowly closed into a fist on the tabletop, her knuckles white. She looked from Jonah to the children, then back towards the door, her expression hardening into something fierce and protective. The fragile sanctuary of the stone cabin suddenly felt paper-thin. The desert, and the men who ruled it with cruelty, had found them. The broth turned to ash in Jonah's mouth. The hoofbeats drummed against the hard pan, a relentless pulse echoing the frantic thudding in Jonah's chest. Each beat vibrated through the stone floor of Clara's cabin, shaking the fragile sense of sanctuary. Outside, the desert twilight bled from fiery orange to bruised purple, the first hard stars piercing the sky like scattered nails. The wind, rising now, moaned around the corners of the rough-hewn walls, carrying the scent of dust and distant sage. Clara moved. It wasn't panic, but a swift, predatory grace honed by necessity. One hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly. The other swept aside a worn Navajo rug near the hearth, revealing a loose floorboard. From the dark cavity beneath, she pulled a long-barreled Sharp's rifle, its oil wood gleaming dully in the flickering lamplight. The sight of it, cool and lethal in her capable hands, sent a fresh jolt of fear through Jonah. Who was this woman? Ezra, Lila, Jonah whispered, his voice tight with urgency. Under the bed. Now, quiet as church mice. Ezra, his face pale but set, grabbed Lila's hand. The little girl clutched her carved horse tighter, her eyes wide pools of terror, reflecting the lamplight. They scrambled beneath the narrow bed frame, vanishing into the deeper shadows there, a small, trembling knot of vulnerability. Clara didn't look at them. Her gray eyes, sharp as flint, were fixed on a small, high window beside the door. She eased the rifle's hammer back with a soft, decisive click that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Jonah felt the graze on his shoulder, forgotten in the initial shock of safety, throb in time with the approaching riders. He scanned the sparse cabin, the rough table, the stools, the cold hearth with its cracked water jug standing sentinel. His own hands felt empty, useless. He wished desperately for the weight of his coat, left behind in the chaos of Ledger's ambush. The hoofbeats grew louder, resolving into the distinct rhythm of several horses moving at a purposeful trot. They sounded close, skirting the boulders that shielded the draw. Jonah braced himself against the wall beside the door, his muscles coiled, ready for the splintering crash. The shouted demands, the flare of violence. He pictured Ledger's cold sneer, the brutal indifference in the eyes of Thorne's hired men. Then the rhythm changed. The horses slowed, then stopped, not directly outside, Jonah judged, but perhaps 20 yards away, just beyond the rocky entrance to the draw. A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind's low whine and the frantic buzzing of a trapped fly against a window pane. Jonah held his breath. Clara stood immobile by the window, a statue carved from desert stone. The sharps held steady, her finger resting lightly beside the trigger. A single voice called out, rough-edged but not overtly threatening. "Clara? Clara, you in there? It's Ansel, from the mercantile." Jonah saw the faintest relaxation in Clara's shoulders, though the rifle didn't waver. Her brow furrowed slightly. She didn't answer. "Clara?" Ansel called again, closer now. Jonah could hear the creak of saddle leather. "Saw smoke. Just check in. Things are bad in town. Clara, real bad." Clara finally moved. She lowered the hammer on the sharps with practiced ease, though she kept the rifle cradled in her arms. She walked to the door, unlatched it slowly, and pulled it open just wide enough to peer out. Jonah stayed pressed against the wall, hidden in the deep shadow beside the jamb, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What is it, Ansel?" Clara's voice, heard for first time since her rescue, was low and husky, like wind over dry reeds. It held no warmth, only a weary caution. Ansel, a wiry man Jonah vaguely recognized from Bitter Hollow's mercantile, sat his horse just outside the ring of boulders. He held the reins of a second, riderless horse. His face, illuminated by the fading light, was etched with genuine distress. "It's the Miller place, Clara," he said, his voice cracking. "Burnt to the ground. This afternoon. Saw the smoke from the ridge." Jonah's blood ran cold. Jeb Miller, his nearest neighbor, another smallholder clinging to the edge of Thorne's claimed territory. A decent man with a wife and 2 young boys. Burned to the ground. Survivors. Clara's question was flat, devoid of inflection, yet Jonah sensed a tension beneath it. Ansel shook his head, his gaze dropping. Nothing left but ashes and charred timbers. Found young Billy's harmonica, melted near the well. He spat into the dust. Thorne's men. Had to be. Ledger was bragging in the saloon just yesterday how stubborn weeds need burning out. Sheriff Cobb just shrugged, like always, says there's no proof. Ansel's voice hardened with impotent fury. Proof? Who else do it? Miller owed Thorne for seed, same as half the valley. Jonah closed his eyes, the image of Jeb Miller's weathered smile flashing before him. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. Himself standing in Thorne's ostentatious office in Bitter Hollow, the air thick with the smell of expensive cigars and greed. Thorne, sleek in a tailored waistcoat, hadn't even looked up from his ledger. Sentiment has no place in business. Hartley. That land holds water. Water is power. Sell now at my price, or circumstances may become unfavorable. Jonah had stood his ground, foolishly believing in deeds and rights. Thorne had merely smiled, a cold, reptilian stretching of lips. Rights? Out here, a man's rights extend only as far as his strength or his friends. You have neither. Hartley. Think on it. He hadn't thought hard enough. Now Jeb Miller was dead, and his own children had been tied to a fence. Why come here? Clara asked, pulling Jonah back to present. Her gaze flicked past Ansel to the surrounding darkness. War, Neen, Ansel said, shifting uneasily in his saddle. Folks are scared. Real scared. Thorne's got Cobb in his pocket, and those gunslingers of his, They're like locusts after Miller. Well, folks are whispering Thorne settling scores, clearing the board. Hartley's spread is next, they say. Heard Ledger swearing he'd find the rancher who got away. Ansel's eyes darted toward the cabin door, as if sensing Jonah's presence. Figured you should know. Clara, you been out here alone. He trailed off, his meaning clear. Her isolation was no longer a shield. It made her vulnerable, especially harboring fugitives. I know, Clara said simply. There was no fear in her voice, only a grim acceptance. That spare nag, Ansel gestured at a riderless horse, a sturdy-looking bay, belonged to Miller. Found it wandering. Figured you could use it, or the meat. God forgive me. He looked genuinely wretched. Just be careful, Clara. Thorne's gone mad with it. There's talk he's put a bounty out. $50 for Hartley, dead or alive. He spat again. Whole town's gone yellow. Clara nodded once, a sharp dip of her chin. Obliged, Ansel. The storekeeper hesitated, casting another nervous glance around the darkening draw. Right. Well, I'd best get back for full dark. You take care now. He wheeled his horse, leading the bay, and disappeared in the gathering gloom, the sound of hoofbeats quickly swallowed by the vastness. Clara closed the door, bolting it firmly. She leaned against it for a moment, her head bowed, the sharps resting against her leg. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper in the lamplight, etched by a burden Jonah could only guess at. The broken locket, tucked away, felt like a tangible presence in the room, a silent testament to her own encounters with loss. It's all right, Jonah said softly, stepping out of the shadows. You can come out now. Ezra and Lila crawled out from under the bed, dust motes dancing in the lamplight around them. Ezra looked shaken, absorbing Ansel's terrible news. Lila scrambled over to Jonah, burying her face against his leg. The wooden horse pressed between them. Jonah met Clara's gaze. Gratitude warred with a crushing sense of responsibility. Thank you, he said, the words feeling inadequate, for the warning and for this. He gestured around the small cabin, their fragile fortress. We brought nothing but danger to your door. Clara straightened, pushing away from the door. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held his. Danger was already coming, she stated, her voice low and certain. She walked to the table and carefully returned the sharps to its hiding place beneath the floorboard, replacing the rug. The action was deliberate, final. She then turned to Ezra. Without a word, she picked up the dented basin and the clean cloth. She refilled it from a cracked water jug, a testament to careful conservation. She gestured for Ezra to sit on a stool. The boy hesitated, glancing at his father. Jonah nodded encouragement. Ezra sat, holding out his arms, the rope burn still raw and angry. Clara knelt before him, her movements slow and careful with her pregnancy. She dipped the cloth, wrung it out, and began gently cleaning the wounds. Her touch was surprisingly tender, her calloused hands steady. Ezra watched her, his initial wariness slowly giving way to a fragile trust. Lila, peeking out from behind Jonah's leg, inched closer, drawn by the quiet care. Jonah watched the scene, a lump forming in his throat. Here was this woman, carrying her own silent grief and the weight of new life, tending to his son with a fierce, unsolicited kindness. The carved wooden horse lay forgotten on the floor near Lila's feet. Then Lila did something that stole Jonah's breath. She bent down, picked up her most precious possession, the small wooden horse smoothed by years of childish love, and held it out towards Clara. She didn't speak, just offered it, her small face solemn, her eyes wide and trusting. Clara paused in her ministrations. She looked at the toy horse, then at Lila. For the first time, Jonah saw a crack in her stoic armor, a flicker of profound emotion, sorrow, recognition, perhaps a memory of innocence lost, crossed her face. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by a softness that hadn't been there before. Very slowly, she reached out and touched the smooth wooden head of the horse, her finger tracing the crude carving. She didn't take it, but the gesture, the fleeting softness in her eyes, was acceptance enough. She gave Lila the faintest nod, a silent communication that seemed to settle the little girl. Lila clutched the horse back to her chest, a small, shy smile touching her lips. Clara returned her attention to Ezra's wrists, her movements gentle once more. Jonah felt a surge of something powerful. Not just gratitude, but a dawning, profound connection forged in shared peril and unexpected tenderness. This silent woman, with her hidden rifle and broken locket, was becoming their anchor. Later, after a sparse meal of beans and cornbread, Jonah stood watch at the small window while Clara rested on the bed, her breathing deep and even despite her condition. Ezra and Lila slept fitfully on the blankets near the hearth, huddled together for warmth and comfort. The desert night was vast and cold, the stars impossibly bright. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence. Jonah's mind churned. The bounty, Miller's murder, Thorne's ruthlessness. They couldn't stay here forever. Clara's sanctuary was compromised. Ansel knew their location. How long before Thorne's men came looking? He needed a plan, a way to fight back, to protect his children, and this woman who had risked everything for them. He thought of the sharps hidden under the floor. He thought of Bitter Hollow, festering under Thorne's shadow. A slight sound made him turn. Clara was sitting up on the edge of the bed, watching him. Moonlight streamed through the high window, silvering her face. She looked exhausted, yet utterly alert. She held something small and metallic in her hand. The broken locket. She didn't open it, just turned it over in her fingers, the moonlight catching the tarnished silver. "He took everything," she whispered, the words so soft Jonah almost didn't catch them. It was the first unprompted thing she'd said about herself. Her voice was raw, scraped bare by memory. Not just land, everything. Before Jonah could respond, ask who he was, her head snapped up, her eyes, wide and suddenly terrified, fixed not on Jonah, but on the locket in her hand. In the moonlight, Jonah saw it clearly, not just broken, but bent, as if crushed by tremendous force. And etched faintly into the silver back, now that he saw it clearly, was a single, stylized letter, T. A cold dread, colder than the desert night, seeped into Jonah's bones. The broken locket, the crushing force. The letter, T, it wasn't just loss Clara carried. It was a history written in violence. A history that bore Silas Thorne's mark. Her enemy wasn't just Jonah's. It was the same. And the bounty on his head wasn't the end of Thorne's vengeance. It was a continuation. The man who had broken Clara's life was hunting them both. The fragile refuge of the cabin vanished. They weren't just hiding from Thorne. They were trapped with the living evidence of his cruelty. And Thorne, Jonah realized with sickening certainty, destroyed evidence. The moonlight bled through the high window, silvering the tarnished T etched into Clara's broken locket. It hung heavy in the silence, colder than the desert night, seeping through the cabin's chinks. Jonah stared, the implications coiling like a rattlesnake in his gut. Thorne, not just Jonah's enemy, but Clara's, the man who'd ordered him tied to a fence, who'd burned the Millers alive, had also shattered something vital in this woman long before. The graze on Jonah's shoulder throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the sharp dread crystallizing within him. Refuge had curdled into a trap. Thorne destroyed evidence. And Clara, with her locket and her hidden grave marker, was living proof of his cruelty. Clara snapped the locket shut, the soft click echoing like a gunshot in the tense quiet. Her knuckles were white around the metal. She didn't look at Jonah, her gaze fixed on the rough-hewn planks of the floor as if reading a grim history written there. Ezra and Lila slept fitfully nearby, huddled under a worn quilt. Lila's carved horse tucked protectively against her cheek. The cracked water jug stood sentinel on the table, its fracture a stark line in the lamplight. He took more than my home, Clara whispered, the words raw, scraped from a place deep and wounded. It was an explanation. It was a fragment, a shard of pain tossed into the darkness. Her voice, usually a low desert wind, cracked with a vulnerability Jonah hadn't witnessed before. She touched her swollen belly, a gesture that seemed both protective and despairing. Took the man who carved that horse for our boy. Her gray eyes flickered towards Lila's sleeping form, then away, clouded with a grief so profound it stole Jonah's breath. Our boy. The words hung, painting a horrifying picture. A child lost, a husband gone, all erased under the shadow of that stylized T. The grave marker outside wasn't just a memory. It was an accusation. Jonah felt a surge of rage, hot and bitter, momentarily eclipsing his own fear. He thought of Sarah, vibrant Sarah, stolen by fever in the same merciless land. The helplessness then mirrored the helplessness now. He moved closer, not touching Clara, but his presence a silent acknowledgement of the shared abyss. He took my Sarah, Jonah murmured, the admission thick in his throat. 2 years back, fever, left me with these two and a hole in the world the size of Texas. He nodded towards his sleeping children. Never thought another man could carve a hole just as deep or fill it with such hate. It wasn't just empathy. It was kinship forged in loss. Clara didn't look up, but her shoulders lost a fraction of their rigid tension. A shared enemy, a shared sorrow. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with understanding. Dawn came reluctantly, painting the desert in bruised purples and harsh oranges. The wind, a constant companion, carried a new edge, the faint, acrid tang of distant smoke, a grim reminder of the Miller place. Jonah knew they couldn't stay passive. Thorne's reach was long, Ledger's persistence deadly. Ansel knew their location. The bounty hung over Jonah like a noose. While Ezra tended the small fire, feeding it carefully with dried mesquite roots Clara had stored, Jonah voiced the fear gnawing at him. "They'll come," he said, staring out the small window towards the boulder-strewn entrance to the draw. "Ledger, maybe Thorne himself, if he's feeling bold. They know we're out here somewhere." Ansel pointed them this way. Clara, who had been grinding dried herbs into a pungent paste at the table, paused. She looked at Jonah, then at the sleeping Lila, her expression hardening back into its familiar, stoic mask. Without a word, she rose, wincing slightly as the baby shifted within her. She went to the hidden floorboard near the hearth, retrieving the Sharp's rifle. But this time, she didn't stop there. From the same hidden space, she pulled a worn leather satchel. Inside, coiled like a sleeping snake, was a length of strong, thin wire, a handful of empty tin cans, and a small, wicked-looking skinning knife. "We make noise before they get close," she stated, her voice flat practical. "Trip lines. Tin cans on rocks. Give warning." She met Jonah's gaze. "You can shoot?" Jonah nodded, a grim determination settling over him. "Used to hunt antelope for the pot. Before Thorne's men took my rifle." He gestured toward the Sharps. "Aim's rusty, but I remember the feel." "Good." Clara handed him the rifle. The weight of it, the oiled wood and cold metal, felt foreign yet grounding in his hands. A tool of survival, not just death. "Ezra." The boy jumped at his name. Clara pointed to the tin cans. "You know the sound these make when kicked?" Ezra nodded, his eyes wide but focused. "Loud, like when Pa dropped the milk pail that time." "Exactly," Clara said. A flicker of something almost like approval crossed her face. "We tie them to the wire, hang them low near the paths in. Wind might rattle them, but a boot will scream." She handed him the wire and cans. "Can you help? Be quiet as shadow." Ezra puffed out his chest, the responsibility momentarily eclipsing his fear. "Yes, ma'am." He took the offered items carefully. Jonah watched, a lump forming in his throat as his son, still bearing the raw marks of the ropes on his wrists, followed Clara's quiet instructions. Ezra moved with seriousness beyond his years, his small hand surprisingly deft as he helped Clara measure and cut the wire. Lila, awake now, watched silently from her nest of blankets, clutching her wooden horse. She didn't join in, but her eyes followed Clara's every move with rapt attention, a small mirror reflecting the widow's quiet strength. Later, as Jonah positioned himself behind a cluster of barrel cactus near the cabin, covering the main approach with the sharps, Clara moved through the pre-dawn gloom like a desert wraith. She showed Ezra where to place the tin can alarms near the two narrow game trails leading into the draw. Her movements were economical, precise, born of familiarity with the land and its dangers that spoke of years lived on the edge. She used the desert itself, a creosote bush here, a jutting rock there, to anchor the trip lines. Jonah saw the knowledge in her eyes, a map of survival etched by hardship. This wasn't just a fence. It was a language of someone who had learned to speak the desert's harsh dialect fluently. They returned to the cabin as the sun crested Coyote Ridge, bathing the draw in harsh, revealing light. The air grew still, heavy with the promise of heat. Jonah was cleaning the sharps mechanism at the table, the smell of gun oil sharp in the small space, when Lila approached Clara. The little girl held out her carved wooden horse, the one Clara had touched the night before. This time, she didn't just offer it. She pressed it into Clara's hand. "For the baby," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible, "to keep him safe, like Pa keeps us." Clara froze. Her breath hitched, a tiny, fractured sound. She looked down at the small wooden figure, smoothed by love and childish worry. For a long moment, she simply held it, her thumb tracing the curve of the horse's back. Jonah saw the struggle on her face. The raw grief for her own lost child wore with the fierce, unexpected tenderness welling up for the scared little girl offering her most precious talisman. Then, slowly, deliberately, Clara walked to the rough stone mantelpiece above the cold hearth. She placed the carved wooden horse beside the cracked water jug. It sat there, a small, defiant symbol of innocence and hope amidst the tools of survival and the hidden weapons of war. She didn't speak, but her hand lingered on the horse for a heartbeat before she turned away, her eyes suspiciously bright. Ezra watched, a small, understanding smile touching his lips. Jonah felt a warm bloom in his chest, fragile but real. They were no longer just survivors sharing a space. They were becoming something else. A found family, bound by loss and a shared enemy. The fragile peace shattered just past noon. Jonah, keeping watch on the shaded side of a large boulder near the cabin, heard it first. The crunch of gravel under a heavy boot, a low curse carried on the wind. Then, the metallic clatter and rattle of one of Ezra's tin can alarms, loud and frantic in the stillness. He ducked lower, peering through a gap in the rocks. 3 riders. Ledger, unmistakable with his scarred cheek and battered hat, led them. 2 rough-looking men flanked him, hands resting near their holsters. They had stopped just beyond the first trip line Ezra and Clara had set near the eastern game trail. Ledger was scowling, scanning the boulders and brush with predatory intensity. "Told you I heard something out here," one of the men grumbled, a lean figure with a tobacco-stained beard. "Ain't just wind. Or a damn jackrabbit," Ledger sneered, his eyes narrow slits. "Ansel said the Hartley trash vanished this way. And that widow woman, she holed up somewhere in these rocks. Thorne wants 'em found, especially the rancher. $50 buys a lot of whiskey." He spat onto the dusty ground. "Spread out. Check every crevice. That cabin's got to be here somewhere." Jonah's blood turned to ice. They were methodical, ruthless. It wouldn't take them long. He eased back, ready to sprint for the cabin, warned Clara, grabbed the children. But as he moved, his boot dislodged a small shower of pebbles. The sound was slight, almost lost in the wind, but Ledger's head snapped around like a hunting dog's, his gaze locking onto Jonah's hiding place. A slow, cruel smile spread across Ledger's face. Well, he drawled, drawing his coat with deliberate slowness. Looks like we found ourselves a rat in the rocks. Come on out, Hartley. Thorne's waiting to have a word. He gestured to his men. Flank him. And if that widow bitch is hiding with him, put a bullet in her belly. Thorne won't mind. Cleaner that way. Jonah pressed himself flat against the boulder, the cold stone biting through his shirt. The sharps fell heavy, useless at this range against 3 drawn pistols. He could see Ledger advancing, confident, his men moving to cut off any retreat. The cabin with Clara and the children was only 30 yards away, but might as well have been 30 miles. He was trapped, exposed. The tin cans had given warning, but it hadn't been enough. The desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Then a sharp, high whistle pierced the air, not a bird call, but deliberate, urgent. It came from the direction of the cabin. Clara's signal. Ledger hesitated, his head swiveling towards the sound. His men paused, confused. In that split second of distraction, Jonah saw his chance. He lunged sideways, scrambling for the deeper cover of a cluster of cholla cactus. Thorns tearing at his clothes. A gunshot cracked, splintering the rock where he'd been a heartbeat before. Dirt stung his face. After him. Ledger roared. Jonah ran, zigzagging, the shouts of the men and the whine of bullets tearing the air behind him. He focused on the cabin door, praying Clara had a plan, praying the children were hidden. He burst through the open doorway, slamming it shut behind him and throwing the heavy wooden bolt just as a body thudded against the outside. Furious pounding shook the door. Inside, the cabin was dim. Ezra and Lila were nowhere to be seen. Hidden, Jonah prayed. Clara stood beside the table, not with the sharps, but with a small, double-barreled Derringer Jonah hadn't known she possessed. Her face was pale but set, her eyes burning with a cold fury. She pointed silently upwards towards a low, sod roof. Understanding dawned on Jonah. The roof, it was their only chance. Open up, Hartley. Ledger's voice bellowed, muffled through the thick wood. We'll burn you out like we did the Millers. Send that widow to hell where she belongs. Jonah looked at Clara, then at the shuddering door. The pounding intensified. The bolt wouldn't hold forever. He met Clara's fierce gaze. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, her other hand steady on the Derringer. The carved wooden horse watched from the mantel. Up. They had to go up. But could they reach the roof before Ledger's men smashed their way in? The air crackled with impending violence. The fragile sanctuary was about to become a killing ground. The pounding on the door was a thunderous heartbeat shaking the cabin's bones. Dust sifted from the rafters like fine snow, catching the slivers of sunlight piercing the high window. Ledger's voice, raw with malice, cut through the wood. Burn 'em out! Smoke the rats. Jonah's gaze locked with Clara's. Her eyes, gray and fierce as storm clouds, held no panic, only a terrifying clarity. She jerked her chin upward again, the silent command urgent. The roof. Jonah lunged for the rickety table, dragging it beneath a rough-hewn beam where a frayed rope dangled, a crude pulley system for storing dried herbs. Ezra, Lila, up, now, he barked, his voice hoarse. Ezra scrambled from behind a stack of firewood, his face pale but set. He boosted Lila onto the table. The little girl whimpered, her eyes wide saucers reflecting the terror vibrating through the door. Jonah grabbed her under the arms, heaving her upward. She scrambled onto the thick beam, clinging like a burr. Grab the rope. Ezra, pull yourself up. Jonah ordered, turning to brace the shuddering door with his shoulder. The bolt groaned against its brackets. Outside, Ledger roared, break it down. Ezra clambered onto the table, his small hand seizing the rope. He hauled, legs bicycling against the air, muscles straining. He reached the beam, pulling himself beside Lila just as a splintering crack echoed through the cabin. The top hinge of the door gave way, with splintering inward. Clara didn't flinch. She stood beside Jonah, the Derringer steady in one hand, her other pressed protectively against her swollen belly. With her free hand, she snatched the cracked water jug from the mantel. its fracture a stark line in the gloom. Jonah saw her intention a heartbeat before she acted. As the door shuddered under another brutal impact, she hurled the jug with surprising force against the stone hearth. It shattered, shards of pottery and precious water sprang across the dirt floor directly in front of the entrance. "Jonah, up!" she hissed, shoving him toward the table. He didn't argue. He scrambled onto the table, grabbing the rope just as the door exploded inward with a shower of splinters. Ledger, pistol drawn, filled the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding desert sun. His boot landed squarely in the puddle of water and jagged pottery shards Clara had created. His legs shot out from under him with a startled curse. He crashed backwards, colliding with the man crowding behind him, a tangle of limbs and angry shouts. Jonah hauled himself onto the beam beside the trembling children. Below, Clara moved with desperate speed. She kicked the Navajo rug aside, snatched the Sharp's rifle from its hiding place, and thrust it upwards. Jonah grabbed the heavy weapon, its cold weight a grim comfort. He swung it around, aiming downward just as Ledger, enraged and dripping, struggled his feet in the doorway. "Get the widow," Ledger bellowed, spitting mud and pottery grit. Jonah didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. The Sharps roared, a concussive blast filling the small space. Smoke billowed. The man directly behind Ledger jerked violently, a dark flower blooming on his chest as he crumpled soundlessly into the dust outside. Ledger ducked back, swearing viciously, dragging his dazed companion with him. "Sniper on the roof. Take cover." Jonah worked a heavy lever, ejecting the spent cartridge. The metallic clang loud in the sudden, shocked silence. Below, Clara was already climbing, wincing as her belly brushed the edge of the table. Jonah reached down, gripping her forearm, hauling her up onto the beam with a grunt of effort. Her skin was slick with sweat, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. For a fleeting moment, pressed together on the narrow beam with the children huddled behind them, the shared peril forged a new, unspoken pact. The sod roof was rough and uneven beneath their knees, radiating the day's accumulated heat like a griddle. The desert stretched before them, vast and pitiless under the high sun. Mesas shimmered in the distance, Coyote Ridge a jagged purple scar on the horizon. Below, Ledger and his remaining man crouched behind their horses, using the animals as shields near the cabin's corner. "Only got a few rounds, Clara," Jonah muttered, scanning for a target. The horses shifted nervously, making clean shots difficult. He remembered the Miller place, the charred timbers Ansel described. Thorne's cruelty wasn't abstract. It was fire and rope and bullets. He thought of Sarah, her laughter echoing in their small homestead before the fever stole it. He wouldn't let that fire touch these children. Or Clara. Ezra peered cautiously over the low roof edge. "Pa, the cans." On the west trail. He pointed a shaking finger toward a cluster of rocks 20 yards away where one of their tripwire alarms lay undisturbed. Jonah nodded grimly. "Good eye, son." Ledger wouldn't risk the open ground again. He'd try to flank them. "Watch that side. Ezra, yell if you see movement." Ezra nodded, his face pale but resolute. Lila pressed herself against Clara's side, burying her face in the woman's calico dress. Clara's arm went around the little girl automatically, pulling her close. Her other hand rested on her belly, feeling the life within kick against the terror outside. She looked down at Lila, then at the carved wooden horse Jonah had tucked into his belt before climbing. The talisman Lila had gifted her unborn child. A memory, sharp as a shard of the broken jug, pierced her. Her own son, Micah, barely older than Ezra, laughing as he chased a lizard near their homestead's vegetable patch. Micah, who had carved clumsy animals from juniper wood. Micah, whose grave lay under the lone mesquite tree near the cabin. And her husband, Thomas, strong and steady, who'd built this cabin stone by stone. Taken, both of them, by Thorne's greed, by Ledger's brutality. The land holds water, Mrs. Vance. Water is power. Your husband was unreasonably stubborn. Thorne's oily voice, slick as snake venom, echoed in her mind. Vance. Her name before the grave marker bore only Clara. Thomas Vance, murdered defending their well. Micah, caught in the crossfire. The locket, a gift from Thomas, crushed under Ledger's boot after. The T wasn't just Thorne, it was the brand of her stolen life. A flicker of movement near the west boulders. Pa, there, Ezra hissed, pointing. Ledger's remaining man, the tobacco-stained beard, was edging along the rocks, pistol drawn, aiming to get a clean shot at the roof. Jonah swung the sharps. The man saw the movement, ducked back. Jonah held his fire, breath tight. They were pinned. The sun beat down, relentless. Sweat stung Jonah's eyes. Clara shifted beside him, a soft gasp escaping her. Jonah glanced at her. Her face was drawn, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the sod. Not just fear, pain. Clara, he whispered, dread coiling. Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the tense standoff. Not gunfire, but the rhythmic drumming of many hoofbeats, growing rapidly louder. Dust plumed on a trail leading north from Bitter Hollow. A sizable group of riders, maybe 8 or 10, approaching at a gallop. Ledger heard it too. He risked a glance. Then a savage grin split his face. "Reinforcements," he yelled to his companion. "Thorne's boys. We got him now." Jonah's heart sank like a stone. Trapped on the roof, low on ammunition, with Clara in pain and children to protect, against a dozen armed men, the desert air, thick with heat and gunpowder, seemed to solidify, pressing down on them. The cracked water jug shattered remains below felt like a symbol of their broken hope. But then, as the riders drew closer, emerging from the dust cloud, Jonah squinted. These weren't Thorne's usual roughnecks. The lead rider sat tall, his clothes dusty but neat. Preacher hailed from Bitter Hollow's crumbling church. Beside him rode Ansel, the mercantile owner, his face grim. And behind them, Jonah recognized faces. Jeb Miller's brother-in-law, the blacksmith's apprentice, even old Mrs. Gantry from the boarding house, clutching a shotgun with surprising determination. Townsfolk, not Thorne's man. Ledger saw it too. His triumphant grin vanished, replaced by bewildered fury. "What the hell?" he spat. Preacher Hale reined in his horse well short, his voice carrying across the draw, strong and clear despite the tension. "Ledger, this ends now. You and your man drop your weapons. The law may be blind in Bitter Hollow, but decent folk aren't." Ansel added, his voice shaking but loud. "We've seen the smoke from Miller's place. We know what Thorne's done. We won't let you burn anyone else." A ripple of surprise, then fragile hope, surged through Jonah. Had the burning of the Millers finally tipped the scales? Had Thorne's terror pushed too far? Ledger, cornered and enraged, made his choice. "Decent folk?" he sneered, raising his pistol not at the townsfolk, but straight toward the figures on the roof, towards Clara and Lila huddled together. "Let's see how decent you feel watching the widow and her brat." The derringer in Clara's hand spat fire. The sharp crack was almost lost in the vastness, but its effect was immediate. Ledger jerked backward, clutching his gun hand. His pistol clattered onto the rocky ground. He stared at his bleeding palm, then up at Clara, pure hatred twisting his scarred face. "You bitch!" The townsfolk surged forward, weapons raised. Ledger's remaining man dropped his pistol, hands flying up. Ledger, snarling, back towards his horse, cradling his wounded hand. Relief, dizzying and sweet, washed over Jonah. They were alive, saved. He turned to Clara, a ragged breath escaping him. "You..." The words died in his throat. Clara was slumped against the sod roof, her face ashen, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her hands were pressed low on her abdomen, her eyes wide with a different kind of fear. A dark stain, small but terrifying, was spreading on the dusty fabric of her dress beneath her hands. "Clara?" Jonah's voice was a strangled whisper. Lila whimpered, clutching Clara's arm. Clara looked up at Jonah, her gray eyes clouded with pain and a dawning, desperate realization. "The baby," she gasped, the words barely audible. Too soon, the running, the fall. She closed her eyes, a tremor racking her body. He won't wait. Below, the townsfolk were securing Ledger's man. Preacher hailed dismounting to approach the cabin. But on the sun-baked roof, with the desert stretching endlessly around them and Thorne's main force surely alerted by the gunfire, a new, more intimate terror took hold. The life Clara had fought so hard to protect was coming into the world now, impossibly early, in the midst of chaos and dust. And Silas Thorne was still out there, his vengeance merely delayed. The sanctuary of the roof vanished, replaced by the precipice of a fragile, desperate beginning. Time fractured on the sun-baked roof. The desert wind, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and the distant shouts of the townsfolk, securing Ledger's companion, felt like a mockery against the intimate terror unfolding. Clara slumped against Jonah, her body rigid with a pain deeper than any bullet wound, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that hitched into low moans. The dark stain on her dress spread, a terrifying blossom in the harsh light. "Too soon," Clara gasped, her voice thin, stripped raw, her hands pressed desperately low. "The fall, the running, he's coming now." Her eyes, wide with primal fear, locked onto Jonah's. It wasn't just a pain. It was the echo of another loss, Micah's small grave stark in her mind. Not again. Please, not again. Panic threatened to swamp Jonah. Below, Preacher Hale's voice boomed, directing men. Ansel was calling up, "Jonah? Clara? You all right?" But up here, it was another world, a world contracting to Clara's pain. Lila's whimpers as she clung to Clara's arm, and Ezra's pale, terrified face. "Mrs. Gantry." Jonah yelled down, his voice cracking. "Get up here. Now. Bring clean cloths, water." The boarding house matron, her shotgun momentarily forgotten, scrambled towards the cabin door with surprising agility. Jonah lowered Clara as gently as possible onto the rough sod. "Easy, Clara. Easy. Help's coming." He ripped off his bandana, uselessly trying to stem the flow. Lila, tears streaming silently, pressed her carved wooden horse into Clara's free hand. Clara's fingers closed around it convulsively, a talisman against the storm within. Mrs. Gantry appeared on the roof moments later, breathing hard, her arms laden with linens and a bucket of water hauled up by Ansel. Her no-nonsense demeanor took charge. "Men, look away. Jonah, hold her shoulders." "Child," she said to Lila, her voice softening. "You hold her hand. Tight now. Ezra, fetch that water closer. And someone find my smelling salts in that satchel." Her presence was a bulwark against chaos. The next hours blurred into a crucible. The desert sun beat down, relentless. Jonah held Clara's shoulders, feeling the tremors rack her frame. Each contraction a wave crashing against a fragile shore. He whispered ragged encouragement, fragment of promises he didn't know if he could keep. "You're strong, Clara, strong as the mesas. Hold on." He remembered Sarah's labor with Lila. The fear, yes, but also the fierce, bright hope that filled their small homestead. Sarah's voice echoed faintly. "It's messy, Jonah Hartley, and terrifying, but it's life pushing into the world. Our life. Hold my hand, you big lump, and tell me it'll be all right." He believed it then, utterly. He willed that same belief into his touch now for Clara. Lila, wide-eyed but determined, mirrored Jonah's actions, patting Clara's hand, whispering, "It's okay, Clara. Be brave. Like the horse." Ezra, jaw clenched, passed water and cloths to Mrs. Gantry, his eyes occasionally darting to horizon, watchful for any sign of Thorne's return. Clara's cries grew louder, torn from a place of utter vulnerability Jonah hadn't imagined her capable of. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead. Between waves of agony, her gaze would fix on the carved horse in her hand, then drift towards a lone mesquite tree where Thomas and Micah lay. "Thomas," she moaned once, The name a raw plea. Jonah understood. She was fighting not just for the life within her, but against the crushing memory of the life violently taken. Nearly there, dearie, Mrs. Gantry murmured, her hands busy, skilled, and surprisingly gentle. One more big push. For Thomas, for Micah, for this little fighter. With a final, guttural cry that seemed to shake the very roof, Clara pushed, and then a new sound pierced the desert air, a thin, indignant wail. Mrs. Gantry lifted a tiny, blood-smeared, squalling bundle. It's a boy, a fighter, just like his mama. A sob escaped Clara, part relief, part overwhelming exhaustion, part profound grief mingled with impossible joy. Jonah felt tears sting his own eyes. Lila clapped her hands, a small, radiant smile breaking through her fear. Ezra exhaled a shaky breath, grinning weakly. Mrs. Gantry swiftly cleaned the infant, wrapping him in clean linen before placing him carefully on Clara's heaving chest. Clara's trembling hand touched the impossibly small head, her gray eyes clouded with pain and tears, softening as she looked down at her son. The carved wooden horse rested beside them on the sod, the fragile moment of peace shattered like glass. A rider, one of the younger townsfolk Jonah recognized as the blacksmith's apprentice, galloped into the draw, his horse lathered. "Thorn!" he shouted, reining up hard below. Ledger must have got word to him. "He's coming." Rode out of town with 6, 7 men. Headed straight for Hartley's place first, they reckon. Says he'll burn it as an example. Ice flooded Jonah's veins. His homestead, the last tangible piece of Sarah, of the life they'd built before Thorn's shadow fell. And Thorn wouldn't stop there. He'd come for the cabin next. For Clara, for the newborn. Clara's eyes snapped up from her baby, meeting Jonah's. The softness vanished, replaced by the flinty resolve he knew. "No," she whispered, then stronger. "No more burning." Her gaze shifted to the tiny face against the skin, then to the grave under the mesquite. "He takes no more." She looked at Jonah, Ezra, Lila. "We end it at your place." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration forged in blood and birth. Getting Clara and the baby down was a tense, careful operation. Preacher Hale took charge. Ansel, Mrs. Gantry, take Clara and the baby to my place in town. Tend to them. Quietly. The rest of us, he looked around at the dozen or so armed townsfolk, their faces set with newfound determination. We ride with Jonah. Thorn's reign of fear ends today at Hartley's fence line. Jonah's homestead looked hauntingly vulnerable under the late afternoon sun. The small cabin, the empty corral, the well Jonah had dug with Sarah watching. All stood silent, waiting. The townsfolk fanned out, taking cover behind the low stone walls of the animal pens, the woodpile, the cabin itself. Jonah crouched near the well, his heart pounding, the Sharp's rifle heavy and ready in his hands. Preacher Hale stood beside him, a double-barreled shotgun resting across his arms. Ezra hunkered down nearby, clutching a heavy piece of firewood, his face pale but resolute. Lila was safe in town with Clara and the baby. The dust cloud appeared first, a smudge on the western horizon, growing rapidly larger. Then came the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats. Silas Thorne rode at the head, impeccably dressed in a dark suit incongruous with the desert, his face a mask of cold fury. Ledger, his right hand bandaged clumsily, rode beside him, hatred burning in his eyes. 6 hardened riders followed. Thorne reined in just beyond rifle range, his gaze sweeping the homestead, lingering on the townsfolk hidden in their positions. A contemptuous smile touched his lips. "Playing at rebellion, preacher?" he called, his voice smooth, oily. "Put down your toys. Hand over Hartley and the Vance woman, and perhaps I'll be merciful. Burn this hovel and be done." Jonah stepped out from behind the well, the Sharps leveled. "This hovel is my land, Thorne. Bought and paid for. You've burned enough, murdered enough. It stops here." Thorne's eyes narrowed. Sentiment Hartley? A fatal weakness. Ledger raised his pistol awkwardly with his left hand. With pleasure, boss. He spurred his horse forward, aiming not at Jonah, but at the preacher. Time for a different sermon. Holy man. The crack of the sharps was deafening. Ledger's horse screamed, rearing as the bullet tore into its chest. Ledger tumbled into the dust with cry, his wounded hand useless to break his fall. He lay stunned, gasping. Before Thorne could react, Preacher Hale stepped forward, his shotgun booming. The charge peppered the ground near Thorne's horse, making it dance sideways in panic. The next one finds its mark, Silas. Hale's voice rang out, strong and unyielding. Drop your iron. All of you. Thorne's riders hesitated, looking from their fallen comrade to the grim faces of the townsfolk, now revealing themselves, weapons aimed. The blacksmith's apprentice, Jeb Miller's brother-in-law, old Mrs. Gantry's nephew. Their expression spoke of grief too long borne, of anger finally unleashed. You think this changes anything? Thorne spat, his composure cracking, revealing the venom beneath. I own this valley. You own nothing but fear, Silas Thorne, Jonah said, walking steadily forward, the sharps trained squarely on Thorne's chest. And that just ran out. He gestured towards Ledger, groaning in the dust. Like your hired guns, like your threats. The law might look away, but these people won't. Not anymore. Not after Miller. Not after Clara Vance. Not after trying to burn children alive. His voice hardened. Get off my land. Get out of Bitter Hollow. Now, or the next bullet isn't for your horse. Silence hung thick and heavy. Thorne's eyes darted, calculating, seeing the unyielding wall of armed townsfolk, seeing Jonah's unwavering aim. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, but so was the dawning realization of defeat. He had gambled on terror, and terror had finally birthed courage. With a final venomous glare, he jerked his reins savagely. This isn't over, Hartley, he snarled, but the words rang hollow. He wheeled his horse, spurring it violently back the way he came. His riders, after a moment's hesitation, followed, one dismounted a haul, a cursing Ledger up onto his horse before galloping after their fleeing boss. The dust cloud swallowed them, leaving only an eerie quiet. A ragged cheer went up from the townsfolk, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roar of relief and defiance that echoed across the empty land. Jonah lowered the sharps, his arms trembling. Preacher Hale clapped a hand on his shoulder. Justice, the preacher murmured. Not the laws, perhaps, but the lands. Later, in the quiet of Preacher Hale's small spare room, Jonah found Clara. She sat propped on the narrow bed, exhaustion etched deep into her face, but her eyes were clear. She held her sleeping son, swaddled in clean linen. Lila sat beside her, gently touching the baby's tiny fist. Ezra stood near the window, keeping watch, his posture straighter, older. Jonah approached slowly. He saw the broken locket lying on the small bedside table, the bent silver catching the lamplight, the tea still visible. Clara followed his gaze. I went at Thomas and Micah, she said softly, her voice raw but peaceful. Before we left the draw, told him. She nodded at the baby, was coming. That Thorne was finished. She picked up the locket. This belongs to the past. She closed her hand around it for a moment, then held it out to Jonah. Throw it in the well at the homestead. Let the water cover it. Jonah took the cold metal, the weight of her pain and her release heavy in his palm. He nodded. He looked at the baby, at Lila's awed expression, at Ezra's protective stance, at Clara's weary strength. The carved wooden horse rested on the pillow beside the baby's head. What will you call him? Jonah asked, his voice thick. Clara looked down at her son's face, then up at Jonah. A faint, weary smile touched her lips. Thomas Micah Hartley, she said softly, if that's all right with you. Jonah felt a lump rise in his throat, a wave of emotion that was grief for Sarah, awe at Clara's strength and a fierce, protective love for this fragile, newly formed family. He knelt beside the bed, his hand covering Clara's where it rested on the baby's blanket. He looked at Ezra and Lila, their eyes wide, hopeful. "More than all right," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "It's perfect. Welcome home, Thomas Micah. Welcome home." Outside, the desert stars emerge, countless and cold, bearing witness. Inside, the lamplight flickered warmly over the faces huddled close. A rancher, a widow, 2 children, and a newborn, bound not by blood, but by fire, rope dust, and an unbreakable resilience. The fence where they'd been tied was miles away, but the strength forged there, carried silently by a pregnant woman across a merciless land, had brought them here, to a beginning, to a homestead waiting to be rebuilt, not just from wood and stone, but from shattered pieces of their past, made whole by the fierce, quiet love of a found family. The wind sighed to the cracks in the preacher's door, carrying away the scent of gunpowder, leaving only the promise of the dawn.